The following is an installment of Backtracking, a pop culture journey by Carlo DiSalvo.
And this is part of his ongoing audio, video, and literary series where he explores pop culture from a very specific Generation X perspective.
And today's deep dive is focusing on his piece, A History of Kids' Afternoon Television Before He-Man and the Transformers Edition.
Which is such a crucial distinction to make. We often think of the 80s as the era of the half-hour toy commercial, right?
He-Man, G.I. Joe, Transformers.
The whole lot. That's the shiny, syndicated corporate 80s. But DiSalvo is pointing us to the micro-era just before that explosion. We are drawing from a really extensive and, frankly, fascinating source.
We are. Today, we're turning away from the future of tech and the complexities of geopolitics.
A bit of a break.
A bit of a break? Yeah. We're doing something that I think is, arguably just as important for understanding how a specific generation thinks. We're doing a little bit of what I like to call TV archaeology.
I love that term, TV archaeology. And it's so true. Usually when we talk about history, we're looking at, wars or elections, massive economic shifts.
Big stuff.
Big stuff. But today, we are zooming in on a very specific and I think very influential slice of the human experience.
Which is?
The carpet of a living room in the early 1980s, a bowl of sugary cereal, and the glowing box in the corner.
We're going to a lost world of after-school television where what you watched totally depended on where you lived. Let's get into it.
So I want you to think about this for a second. Before He-Man was shouting, "By the power of Grayskull," and way before Transformers were waging their battles on our planet, what exactly filled that sacred after-school TV slot? I'll tell you what, it was a totally different world.
Oh yeah, I know you remember this. That school bell rings and you are out of there. You race home because you know this absolute explosion of action and animation is waiting for you. It was this whole universe of good guys and bad guys fighting it out every single afternoon right in your living room. For a kid, it was pretty much the greatest thing ever.
But here's the question. What was on TV in those afternoon hours before He-Man showed up, before the Transformers took over? What did you watch when you dropped your backpack on the floor?
And that's the big question here, isn't it? What did you do? What was that sacred time between the last school bell and your mom yelling that dinner was ready actually like? This quote really paints a picture of a media world that's just gone. No endless scrolling, no binge watching. It was a time of limits, for sure. But as you're about to see, those limits kind of created their own kind of magic.
Now we're zeroing in on a really specific window of time here. Think 1979 to about 1983. What's so wild about this period is that it's right before the giant syndicated cartoon explosion. Before shows like He-Man and G.I. Joe were on every single afternoon. This was the quiet, cozy calm right before that storm hit.
We're heading to an era that, honestly, feels almost like a different planet now. We're going to dive deep into the after-school routine of the early 1980s, where coming home from school kicked off this very specific and pretty special ritual.
It all starts with a feeling I think every kid understands. You come home from school, you're just totally wiped out, and you desperately need an escape. That feeling, well, that became a refuge. It was the start of a ritual that really defined his afternoons.
And this refuge wasn't just about zoning out in front of a screen. Oh no, it was way more specific than that. It was built around this very precise, almost sacred, after-school routine. This was the sequence of events that officially slammed the book on the school day and opened the door to a few precious hours of pure, unadulterated downtime.
For the person whose memories we're drawing from, school wasn't just boring, it was genuinely draining. So coming home wasn't just nice, it was a necessary escape. This whole after-school routine, it was a way to decompress, to recharge your batteries after a long day.
He was an introvert, and it's not that he didn't like people or being social. He actually did. But here's the difference. Unlike extroverts who get a real energy boost from being around others, for him, it just drained his tank. And school, well, it's basically one big, long, highly social, super stimulating event.
I absolutely love this analogy. It's so perfect, and I think a lot of us can relate to it. It's not just that his battery drains throughout the day. It's like it starts the day already half empty. The second he walked into that school building, that social battery just plummeted, and the countdown to that final bell was officially on.
And this is a really key insight. For him, recharging didn't always mean being in total solitude. It wasn't just about being alone. It was about changing the conditions of his environment.
And it's actually pretty brilliant when you break it down into these 4 steps. First, step 1, escape the crowd. Get out of that overstimulating school environment. Step 2, control your own environment. Go somewhere familiar and comfortable, like home. Step 3, choose your company. This didn't always mean being totally alone, but it meant maybe just 1 or 2 close friends. And finally, step 4, do something low stakes, something relaxing.
And all of this led to this sort of unwritten universal procedure. And the priorities were crystal clear. You get home, and step 1, without a doubt, is food. A snack was absolutely non-negotiable. Only then could you even think about entertainment. Homework? That was a problem for future you, right?
Okay, so let's talk about that first, most crucial step, the snack. This was not about grabbing an apple. Oh no, this was a ritual, and it was pretty much centered around one glorious, sugary food group.
And you gotta understand, not all cereals were created equal. There was a strict divide. Breakfast in the morning, that was for the quote-unquote responsible stuff. Raisin Bran or Chex. But the afternoon, that was prime time for the sugary heavy hitters. And our source does not mess around here. This wasn't just a little sweet. This was toothache-inducing level sugar. It was a pure, unapologetic treat for surviving another day of school.
And this whole ritual had its own cast of characters. The star of the show was often Peanut Butter Captain Crunch. The co-star? A glass of Nestle Quick. And it wasn't always a solo act. Friends would often be there to join in on the sugar rush.
So, with your bowl of cereal in hand, it was time for Phase 2, the great cartoon hunt. And believe me, hunt is exactly the right word, because it was not as simple as just turning on the TV.
And right away, you'd hit your first obstacle. A classic problem in so many houses back then. The main TV, the good one, was already taken. In this case, Grandma was watching her soap operas. That meant you had to find another screen, which forced you to get a little creative. And this led to some of the best, coziest setups ever. You might have kids all piled onto a sofa or huddled together on the bottom bunk bed, all staring at this tiny little 9-inch TV on a rickety cart. These weren't home theaters. They were little dens of after-school bliss.
And actually finding a cartoon was the next part of the challenge.
You had a handful of channels, maybe 5.
The good stuff wasn't on the big 3 networks. No, you had to go hunting on these independent stations, a lot of them on the UHF dial.
Okay, we have to pause there for a second and define that term because it comes up a lot in the research. UHF, for anyone listening who didn't grow up, wrestling with an antenna on their TV set, what are we talking about here?
So in the old analog days, you had 2 bands of television broadcasting. You had VHF, that's very high frequency.
Right.
That was channels 2 through 13 on that big chunky dial. And these were the prime real estate. This is where your big network affiliates were, ABC, CBS, NBC. They had the money, the national news, the crisp, clear signal.
The penthouse suites of the TV dial.
Precisely. Then you had the other dial. Sometimes it was on the bottom. Sometimes it was a separate loop antenna you had to mess with. That was UHF, ultra high frequency.
Yeah.
Channels 14 all the way up to 83.
And the signal wasn't as good, right?
Not at all. The signals didn't travel as far. They were physically harder to tune in. That dial didn't have that satisfying click. It just sort of slid. And these were the independent stations.
The scrappy underdogs.
They were the underdogs, 100%. They didn't have the massive network budgets or, a national feed coming in, 247. So they had to fill hours and hours of airtime with whatever they could get their hands on.
It was a real treasure hunt through the airwaves.
It was totally an active pursuit. The reward wasn't just watching the show itself, but the deep satisfaction of a successful hunt. The pure joy of discovery, that incredible feeling that you'd unearthed a lucky find all on your own.
For him, growing up in the Maryland suburbs, his whole world pretty much revolved around channels 20, 45, and 5.
For kids on a weekday afternoon, the UHF channels were, quote, where all the good stuff was found. It wasn't really a secret. It was just a fact of after-school life.
And of course, every rule has an exception, right? Well, DC's was a big one. It was a channel that lived down in the VHF neighborhood, but totally played by UHF rules. It was this amazing independent station that completely changed the game for local kids.
So in DC, you had WTTG on Channel 5. It was a VHF station, but critically, it was independent, which made it the go-to spot for afternoon shows. Then you'd click over to the UHF dial, and you had your 2 PBS stations, WMPT, which was Maryland Public Television, and WETA, which served the bigger metro area.
And those PBS stations, man, they were like a comforting home base. Even as you got a little older and maybe felt like you were growing out of shows like Sesame Street or The Electric Company, you'd still find yourself flipping over to Channel 22 or 26, just to check in on your old friends, especially if nothing else was on.
But there was something kind of strange about these channels. As a kid, turning that dial, you just knew the higher the channel number, the more static you were going to have to deal with. It was just a fact of life. So why in the world did these two PBS stations buried deep in UHF territory come in so perfectly clear? Yeah, this was the normal UHF experience, right? A total snowstorm of static. You were in this constant battle with the rabbit ear antennas, just trying to twist them into the perfect position to catch a clean signal for maybe a few minutes.
But not these channels. No way. Turning to channel 22 or 26 was like magic. All that static would just vanish. The picture would lock right in, sharp and stable. It totally defied everything we thought we knew about the UHF band. So, what was their secret?
Well, the answer wasn't magic, of course. It was all about the engineering. Public broadcasting stations invested in these beasts, high-powered transmitters. Think of it like this. Most stations were kind of whispering their signal out, but PBS was shouting it. This technology was specifically designed to blast a strong, reliable signal over a massive area. And you gotta understand it, this was totally on purpose. It wasn't some happy accident. Public broadcasting had a mission, and that mission was to reach as many people as possible, period. To actually pull that off on the weaker UHF band, they had to invest in powerful, top-of-the-line broadcast technology. That crystal clear PBS signal you remember, it wasn't your imagination. It was the result of a very deliberate plan to build a better broadcast. So here's why this really matters. That strong signal meant that access to educational programming wasn't a luxury, it was a guarantee. It established public broadcasting as this trusted, foundational pillar on the airwaves, building a reputation for quality and reliability that's lasted for decades. For millions of kids, it turned a part of the dial known for static into this dependable, safe haven for learning and discovery. And, that leaves us with a pretty big question for today. Back in the analog world, a strong UHF signal was the key to universal access. But in today's world of countless streaming apps and different internet plans, how do we make sure that everyone still has access to the vital information they need?
So let's say you did it. You found a TV, you wrestled with the antenna, and you tuned in a station. What were you actually watching? Well, this gets to the heart of what made this whole experience so different.
Saturday mornings, that was prime time. That was for the big leagues, the newest, most hyped-up cartoons on the major networks. But weekday afternoons, that was a whole different ballgame. The independent stations filled these hours with cheaper programming. It was the land of reruns, classic old cartoons, and syndicated shows.
So you ended up with this really clear division. VHF was for the big, scheduled events, like Saturday mornings, the official stuff. But UHF? That was our time, weekday afternoons. It felt like this unofficial block of programming that was made just for us.
And this quote just nails the feeling perfectly. It wasn't that race home from the bus kind of exciting television, not yet anyway, but it was reliable, it was comforting. It was a small, simple reward that you knew was waiting for you at the end of a long day.
DeSalvo mentions that even though you only had these few channels to choose from, there was this immense satisfaction in that limited range. He calls the programming decent enough to really good.
I love that phrase.
I think that phrase just captures the whole essence of the era perfectly, doesn't it?
Decent enough to really good. It implies that you weren't expecting cinematic masterpieces at 3:30 in the afternoon on a Tuesday.
No, not at all.
You were just looking for comfort, for something familiar.
Exactly. And he describes his routine not as this rigid schedule, I have to watch this show at this time. It was more like a series of regular choices. It wasn't about binge watching a whole season. It was about just seeing what was on between the afternoon and the evening and navigating those limited options you had.
But in a world with no streaming, no on-demand, the word rerun just didn't mean the same thing. For a kid in 1981, a Bugs Bunny cartoon from the 50s, that was brand new. Every single rerun was a potential first-time discovery.
So, before we really dive in, just think about it for a second. What was your routine? Did you have a show you had to race home for? Who were those local faces you saw on TV every single afternoon? We're about to jump into a world that might feel really familiar, even if the names and faces are totally different from the ones you remember.
the world of after-school children's television. Really unique, kind of forgotten world. Now, this was a special moment, right before the whole cable cartoon revolution changed everything. A time when, believe it or not, the people introducing the cartoons were often bigger stars than the cartoons themselves. Okay, now you've got to picture this scene. This was not some big family gathering around a giant screen in the living room. More often than not, it was just him watching this tiny little 9-inch TV on a rolling cart in his bedroom. You know, sometimes friends would come over and they'd all be crammed onto the bottom bunk with their eyes just glued to that little screen.
So right before that big syndicated cartoon revolution hit, what did the TV lineup actually look like? What was your reward for surviving another day of school? Well, for one, there were reruns. A lot of reruns. We're talking old school black and white classics like Leave It to Beaver or The Andy Griffith Show. You know, they're nice, they're comforting, but they probably weren't going to make you sprint home from the bus stop. These shows were kind of like the quiet appetizer before the main course of cartoons was served.
Now, for a kid in the 80s, these shows were already ancient. I mean, Leave It to Beaver is from the 1950s.
They were mostly in black and white, or that weird early color. But they were still in heavy rotation on these UHF stations. And the reason is simple, because the licensing rights were cheap.
DeSalvo talks about the timing of these shows. When did they typically air?
Usually in the late morning or the early afternoon, so if you were in school, you would miss them. They were really for the stay-at-home crowd or, the much younger kids who weren't in school yet.
Unless
you got out of school early for some reason, or if you just raced home. He mentions that if he got home by 2.0 or 2.3 in the afternoon, he might be able to catch the tail end of one of them.
And he calls it a mood strike.
Yeah. He says he normally preferred cartoons. Obviously, cartoons are high energy, they're exciting. But sometimes the mood just struck him to watch a classic. Which is interesting because this accidentally exposed an entire generation of 80s kids to 50s and 60s culture, simply because it was cheap programming for the local station to buy and fill time.
That is so true. I know way, way too much about the plot of Leave It to Beaver, solely because of 3.0 Euro PM reruns. It created this very strange but shared cultural bridge.
It created a shared cultural language across generations that we don't really get anymore. Today, a kid isn't going to accidentally watch a show from 40 years ago just because it's the only thing on TV. They're going to be watching a YouTuber who uploaded a video 10 minutes ago.
But here's the thing you gotta understand. The real stars of this era weren't the characters in those sitcoms. They were these local TV personalities. These folks were basically the mascots for their channels, and they were the ones who would actually guide you through the afternoon shows with a really personal touch.
Back then, your options were super limited. And here's the key thing. That scarcity is exactly what made these local hosts so important. They were these friendly, familiar faces that guided you through the afternoon. They were kind of like a virtual babysitter for a whole generation of kids in their town.
And if you were a kid growing up in the Baltimore and DC area back then, your afternoons were pretty much commanded by two really memorable, but really different guys they called captains.
So the local TV personality wasn't just, a host. They were a branding strategy that was born out of a technological necessity.
That's a great way to put it, yeah. They were the glue that held all the cheap cartoons and the old black and white movies together.
So we're focusing on two specific markets today to really illustrate this whole ecosystem. We're heading to the Mid-Atlantic, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C.
That's right. We're looking at Channel 45 in Baltimore and Channel 20 in D.C. And the source material, it makes a really important distinction here about the timeline. These personalities, they existed before the big syndicated cartoon revolution. In the late 70s and the early 80s, the station itself had to provide the context. These local hosts, they were the bridge. They were the ones who guided the kids from the school bus all the way to the evening news.
So our mission today is to explore this whole history through DeSalvo's eyes. We're going to look at the strange, the multi-talented, and, let's be honest, the highly adaptable world of hosts like Captain Chesapeake and Captain 20.
And adaptable is the key word there. As we're about to see, these guys had to be the Swiss Army knives of broadcasting.
Let's start in Baltimore then, Channel 45, WBFF. And let's bring on Captain Chesapeake.
Portrayed by the late, great George A. Lewis.
Now, just the name itself, Captain Chesapeake, that does a lot of the heavy lifting right there.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It anchors the show in the local geography immediately. If you're a kid in Baltimore, the Chesapeake Bay is your backyard. So it implies authority, a connection to the water, a sense of local pride. The whole lore of the show is that he hosted it from the captain's seat of his boat.
Which is such a simple but really effective set design for a local station that's working on a shoestring budget. You don't need a massive sound stage or, a bunch of CGI. You just build a wooden ship's wheel, maybe you hang some netting that you bought at a boating supply store, you paint a blue backdrop, and boom, you're a captain. You're on the water.
All about theater of the mind.
Mm-hmm.
But his role was so crucial. He wasn't just sitting there, looking nautical. He introduced the morning and the afternoon cartoons. He had puppet sidekicks like Mundy the Sea Monster. He was the continuity.
And this is where it gets really interesting for me, the interactivity. Because we tend to think of interactive TV as a modern invention. We think of live tweeting a big event or voting on an app for a singing competition.
Right.
But in the early 80s, that desire for interaction was just as strong. So how did a kid in, say, 1982 interact with Captain Chesapeake?
He used the United States Postal Service.
Snail mail. It's so analog.
You would become a crew member. The source details this whole mechanism where kids would mail in these membership forms were just letters. And the reward, the big payoff for that effort, was that Captain Chesapeake might, just might, read your joke or show a drawing you sent in on the air.
The stakes here feel incredibly high. I mean, if I'm thinking back to being 7 or 8 years old.
Oh, they were massive.
Yeah.
You have to imagine the timeline here. Today, you post a comment online, you get a like in 5 seconds.
Instant gratification.
Right. But back then, you write a letter, you have to beg your mom for a stamp, you walk it all the way to the mailbox, and then you just wait.
And you watch.
You watch every single day, specifically for that one segment where he reads the mail from his crew. The anticipation loop is weeks, maybe months long.
And DeSalvo shares it's almost a heartbreaking personal anecdote about this, isn't he? It's like a little childhood tragedy in 3 acts.
It is. He writes about sending in a joke to Captain Chesapeake. He was apparently incredibly proud of this joke. He mailed it off, and then he just watched. For months, every single afternoon, he'd tune in at 3:00 p.m., glued to the screen, just waiting to hear his name.
And what happened?
Nothing. Total silence.
Oh, man. That's rough. So why? Was the joke just not funny? Does he bomb?
Well, we'll never know if the joke was any good humor is subjective after all. But the problem was, it was bureaucratic.
Bureaucratic.
He realized later, much, much later in life, that he didn't understand the prerequisite. You had to be an official crew member first before you could even have your material read on the air.
Oh, no. He didn't read the terms and conditions.
I guess the fine print. But I think that analysis point you mentioned earlier is so vital here. It shows how much power these local figures really held in a kid's world. A kid would invest months of daily, focused attention just for the possibility of getting a single second of acknowledgement from the guy in the boat captain's hat.
It really emphasizes the relationship, doesn't it? It wasn't just about content consumption. It was about building a community. Even if it was, a one-sided one for DeSalvo in that particular instance, it created this sense of belonging to Channel 45. You weren't just a viewer, you were a crew member.
Precisely. And that loyalty is what kept that station alive against the big, powerful network affiliates.
Okay, so that's Baltimore. That's sort of the classic host model. Now let's move just down the road to Washington, D.C. We're going to Channel 20, WDCA. And the man of the hour, Captain 20.
Now, if Captain Chesapeake was a classic host, Captain 20, and he was portrayed by Dick Deisel, he was a phenomenon.
This character was a chameleon who totally evolved with the times. He started out in 1969 as an astronaut, riding that whole space race wave. By 1972, he was an alien with pointy ears and purple hair. And then by the early 80s, when our author was watching, he'd morphed into just a regular-looking guy with a mustache. The captain title was more like a superhero name by then.
And Captain 20's job went way beyond just introducing cartoons. He was the voice of the entire station, introducing everything from sitcoms to late-night movies.
But the story of Captain 20, it gets even more fascinating when you pull back the curtain. Because the guy who played him, well, he was a true local TV legend who wore many, many different hats.
His name was Dick Deisel, and this guy? He was basically the engine that made Channel 20 run. Calling him a one-man TV station isn't an exaggeration at all. He did so much more than just stand in front of a camera and introduce a cartoon. I mean, just look at this. In 1972, he takes over as both Captain 20 and the local Bozo the Clown at the same time. And even after the Bozo show wrapped up, he was still hosting other local kids shows. His run as Captain 20 went all the way to 1987, which is deep into that golden age of cartoons we were talking about.
But on the weekend, he'd transform into this spooky late-night horror host named Count Gordeval. This is just incredible. One guy, Dick Diesel, was all three of these local icons. The guy was basically a one-man television station, a total master of creating these completely different characters.
Now you might be thinking, wait a second, Bozo the Clown was a local show? I thought he was a national thing. And the fact that Dick Diesel could be the DC Bozo opens up this whole other forgotten concept, the franchise TV show. The idea was brilliant, really. A company would license out the character and the show format, but each city would produce it with their own host, their own set, their own local flavor. It's why your parents' memory of Bozo might be completely different from someone's who grew up in another state.
And this whole franchising model created this wild, tangled history of early television. Get this, the first Bozo in DC, before Dick Diesel ever put on the makeup, was a young Willard Scott. Yep, that Willard Scott, the guy who would become the famous weatherman on NBC. And if that's not wild enough, Willard Scott was also the very first person to ever play Ronald McDonald in the commercials. It's just a strange, small world, isn't it?
And this really shows you how creative they had to be back then. The character of Captain 20 wasn't just one thing, he had to evolve. He started out in '69 as an astronaut to tie into all the moon landing excitement. Made sense. Then, when that faded, Diesel made him into this quirky alien with pointy ears. And by the time most kids from that era remember him, he was just sort of an everyday guy who acted as the superhero protector of Channel 20 itself.
By the time we get to the 1980s, which is the era DeSalvo remembers best, he was just a normal-looking guy. He'd wear street clothes, maybe uniform jackets sometimes, but mostly he was just a guy, and he had a mustache.
Just a guy with a mustache. But he was still called Captain 20.
Still Captain 20. And this is what's fascinating. DeSalvo notes in the text that even though he looked like a regular person, he still viewed him as a superhero. He compares him to Captain Marvel.
Why? Was it just because of the name Captain, or was there something else going on?
It was partly the name. But also, DeSalvo says that he interpreted the character as representing Channel 20 itself. Like he was instilled with the power to promote and defend the station. And on a more practical level, DeSalvo notes that, quote, a person had to be a superhero to be able to handle as many jobs as Captain 20 did.
That is such a perfect piece of kids' logic, but it's also completely accurate. He was the hardest working man in local show business, for sure.
He really was. I mean, he was the announcer for everything. Kids shows, old sitcoms, movies. He was the voice and the face of the entire channel.
There's one specific memory that DeSalvo shares about Captain 20 that I think is really important, especially when we talk about media literacy. It's a PSA, and it deals with special effects.
This is a great example of media literacy being taught way, way before that was a buzzword in education.
So describe the spot for us. What happened in it?
So the PSA starts, and you see Captain 20, and he appears to be flying through the air. You know, standard superhero stuff. Arms out in front of him, maybe a cape fluttering, sky moving behind him.
The classic Superman pose.
Right. But then the image changes. It either pulls back or it crossfades, and it reveals the trick. It shows him just lying on his stomach on a table in front of a blue screen.
The magic is ruined.
But for a very important purpose. The whole lesson was to teach kids not to imitate the stunts that they saw on TV. To show them, look, this isn't real. I can't actually fly. It's a camera trick. It's a blue screen, so please don't jump off your garage roof.
That is actually really profound for a local kids show host. Usually the goal is to maintain the illusion at all costs, you know, don't look behind the curtain. But here he's actively peeling back the curtain to keep the kids safe.
It is. It's treating the audience with a bit of respect, actually. It's showing them the mechanics of the medium they're watching. It demystifies television in a really healthy way.
So we have this golden age of the captain, the versatile hero of Channel 20, but then the source material introduces a conflict, a turning point. The year is 1979.
The corporate buyout. A company called Taft Broadcasting buys WDCA-TV.
And usually, you know, when a big company buys a local station, you expect changes. Cost-cutting, maybe a slick new logo. But this wasn't just about business. This was about content regulation, wasn't it?
It was. The license transfer for the station was actually challenged. Local parents groups got involved.
Ah, the parents groups, the arch nemesis of all 80s fun.
Well, depending on your perspective. But their grievance was very specific. They opposed the license renewal because of what they called violent kids programming on Channel 20.
And what were they citing as violent? Are we talking about, like, slasher movies being shown in the afternoon?
No, nothing like that. The source lists the shows they complained about. Ultraman, Speed Racer, and
Bunny.
Bugs Bunny. Okay, I guess there are anvils falling on people's heads and sticks of dynamite, but come on.
It was a different time. There was this growing concern in the culture about the effects of media on children. What we would call slapstick was being reevaluated as cartoon violence. And Taft Broadcasting, to get the deal approved by the FCC, they had to make a compromise. So what was the deal? What did they have to do?
They promised to produce 2 daily shows that had educational or informational content, plus a bunch of PSAs and specials. They basically had to offset the perceived violence of Speed Racer with some genuine learning.
And who did the burden fall on to make all this happen? I'm guessing they didn't hire a whole team of educators from Harvard.
Of course not. They looked at the guy who was already in the hallway, Dick Deisel.
Of course they did. Hey, you clown vampire captain guy, can you also teach the kids some math?
Pretty much. In January of 1980, he is asked to create and produce the very first one of these new shows.
So let's talk about these educational shows, because this is where we see that adaptability we talked about really come into play. The first one was called WOW.
Yes, WLW. And it was hosted by Dick Deisel as Captain 20.
What was the format for that one?
It was a live audience studio show. Well, a small audience. Captain 20 would be on the set with maybe 4 children. He would interview them. They would make nutritious snacks.
Nutritious snacks. A classic of the educational TV genre. Are we talking celery and peanut butter?
Almost certainly. And ants on a log, probably. And he would show drawings that viewers sent in, but then they would show a short cartoon, and afterwards they would all discuss it. They would analyze what the cartoon was about.
So it's like a book club, but for cartoons.
Exactly. It was a clever way to satisfy the educational mandate by just adding a layer of critical thinking on top of the entertainment. Why did that character do that? What did we learn from this?
Okay, so that's WOW. That seems manageable. But Taft Broadcasting promised 2 shows.
Right. And the second one, which was called Kids Break, premiered in June of 1980. Now, originally, a different producer was supposed to handle this one. But
yes, it eventually ended up on Deisel's desk.
It did. After just a few months, Deisel was asked to take over the production of this one, too. But here's the problem. He was already doing a live studio show with WOW. He didn't have the time or the resources or the studio space to mount another full studio production with live kids and snacks.
He's only one man. He's already the captain, the host, the producer, the vampire. He can't be in 2 places at once.
So he had to get creative. And he looked to a very successful model. He looked at Sesame Street.
So what does that mean?
I mean, short, pre-produced segments. You don't need a live audience. You don't need a complex, continuous flow in the studio. You just need a bunch of short clips that are held together by an in-studio host.
But Captain 20 was busy over on the set of WIW, so who hosted Kids Break?
Well, he couldn't clone himself, so he went for the next best thing, puppets.
And this is where we meet Howard Hughes.
Howard Hughes, a furry puppet that the source describes as resembling a green Cookie Monster.
A green Cookie Monster. Okay, so legally distinct from the blue one. Got it.
Barely. And he wasn't alone. There was a whole cast of puppets on this show, and the source material is really funny about the quality control here.
Yeah, DeSalvo's pretty honest about it, isn't he?
He is. He says the quality of the puppets ranged from almost as good as Muppets, which is high praise.
Very high praise.
Down to Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood style, which is, charming in its own way. And then to less than either.
Less than either is a very polite and diplomatic way of saying a terrifying sock puppet that was created 5 minutes before they went to air.
He basically admits it. He says, looking back on it from a modern perspective, with our high-definition TVs, people might say, yikes, those puppets look really creepy. But he makes a really important point about context.
Which is?
Back then, on a 19-inch CRT television with a slightly fuzzy UHF signal, they were just puppets. They were just background noise. They were just what was on between the other shows. Kids didn't judge the production value the way we do now with 4K screens where you can literally see the hot glue on the felt.
That's so true. We just accepted it. Okay, the green monster's talking now. Fine. When is the cartoon coming back on?
Exactly. It was just part of the texture of the afternoon.
Now, within this show, Kids Break, there was a specific segment, a series of PSAs, that DeSalvo says stuck with him more than anything else from that time. The mini-facts.
Mini-facts. These were short little skits that taught a lesson, and they aired during the commercial breaks.
And there's one specific math lesson that he details, and I think this speaks to how these little things can just burrow into your brain and stay there forever.
The currency lesson.
Break it down for us.
The lesson was incredibly simple. It was teaching the value of a quarter. A quarter equals 2 dimes and a nickel, or it equals 5 nickels, or it equals 25 pennies.
Truly groundbreaking stuff.
But the point was the repetition, the idea that any combination of change that added up to 25 cents was the same value. And DeSalvo says these mini facts stuck in his memory way more than the actual shows like WOW or Kids Break.
Why do you think that is? Why do we remember the PSA about the nickel more than, the interview with some kid on the set of WOW?
I think it's the repetitive nature of a commercial break.
Right.
You might watch a specific episode of a show once, but a PSA, you could see that every single day, maybe twice a day, for months. It just becomes part of the rhythm of your afternoon. It drills that information into your head.
It's the jingle effect. It's rote memorization disguised as a little bit of entertainment.
Precisely. And for a kid, mastering money, understand that 5 of these little round things is the same as one of those bigger round things. That's actually a moment of empowerment. It's a life hack for a 7-year-old. It gives you a little bit of agency in the world. I know what this coin is worth.
That's a great point. It's practical, real-world knowledge, and it was delivered by a green puppet.
So beyond the local captains, this whole era was just filled with shows that have kind of fallen through the cracks of pop culture history. Let's look at a perfect example. A very specific version of a very, very famous club that most people have completely forgotten ever existed.
Okay, so there have been 3 big eras of the Mickey Mouse Club. We all know the iconic 1950s original, right? And we definitely all know the 90s version that gave us superstars like Britney Spears and Justin Timberlake. But sandwiched right there in the middle was the 1970s revival. It had updated music, psychedelic colors, a diverse cast, but for some reason, it just didn't stick. It was the version the author remembers watching, but it's one that has left almost zero cultural footprint.
So you gotta ask, why is it so forgotten? Well, there are a few key reasons. For one, it was just stuck between 2 absolute pop culture juggernauts. Its biggest star, Lisa Whelchel, went on to be on The Facts of Life, which is great, but that's not the kind of global superstardom we saw from the 90s cast. But maybe the biggest reason was how it was shown. It aired in syndication, which meant its airtime and channel was different in every city. And without ever getting a DVD release, it's become a true piece of lost media, mostly just living on in fuzzy YouTube clips and in people's fading memories.
So let's bring this all together. Why does this history of quirky local captains and these forgotten TV shows even matter? What did this whole era of television really stand for?
When you boil it all down, these hosts created a genuine local community. They were your captain, your bozo. They talked about local events. They read jokes from kids who lived in your town, maybe even on your street. In a world before the internet and 1,000 cable channels, they created this shared experience that was totally unique to your city.
And that really brings us to our final thought. This whole journey into one person's after-school routine isn't just about being nostalgic. It's a reminder of a time when media was super intensely local. And it makes you wonder, what local shows or hosts or cultural moments from your own past are just fading from our collective memory, totally lost in this age of global, on-demand streaming? What's your Captain 20?
Well, in these first 2 parts, we've really just set the stage, right? We've introduced the local players and touched on a few of the big shows. But trust me, we are only just getting started. Parts 3 and 4 are where things are going to really ramp up, so you're not going to want to miss them in the next part of our journey.